This is your Daily 5 for Monday, August 10th, 2026. As part of prep for the next late night double feature, Lando and I watched the second film we'll be talking about, that I'll be talking about with Dr. Doug Bielmeyer as part of that series, 1996's Space Truckers. Now, Space Truckers, for some people, is probably a movie that you immediately know. Whether good or bad, you probably know it because it was one of those movies that was pervasive when it came out. It was a movie that was filmed for HBO. And it was originally, I think, intended to have a theatrical release, but never did. It came out on HBO and, of course, was in heavy circulation. And then it just kind of up and vanished. And it's a weird movie because to describe it to somebody who's not already into movies of this type, and this is an absolute solid B movie. It's directed by Stuart Gordon, who has made an entire career out of doing B movies like Robot Jox, Reanimator, that type of thing. Movies that landed very well with the audience they were aimed at, but were next to impossible to sell to the average mainstream movie viewer if they weren't already invested in that type of genre that the movie was set in. So trying to convince somebody to watch Reanimator if they weren't already into horror movies, and even then they'd have to be into B movies, is a tough sell. You can say how great it is all day long, but some people just won't connect with a movie if it doesn't feel like it's a top-end, Steven Spielberg production. And the reality is that Space Truckers, like Reanimator, like Robot Jox, you can immediately tell that there are limitations on the film. And they are primarily, of course, budgetary, which is mostly the case with movies like this. And so some people will just see that as cheap, instead of realizing that there's actually a lot of really interesting creativity and imagination in working around restraint, as Lando and I talk about on the show often. And Space Truckers is actually a really good example of that ability, and where sometimes you can see the seams and they simply cannot get around them. So, as an overview, Space Truckers is a blast. It is one of the more entertaining, solidly B-movie films that you're going to watch where you know exactly what it is and it delivers what it's trying to be in a nice, tight, quick fashion where you're going to get on the other side and you'll have had a very good time. And it also, as I said earlier, will showcase how a good director can cover up many of the flaws and limitations of a lower budget feature, and where sometimes you're going to see where they couldn't do it because they simply did not have the budget to do it. So, in Space Truckers, which is exactly what it sounds like, it is a movie about a space trucker played by Dennis Hopper, who ends up paired up with the absolutely mesmerizing Debbie Mazar, whose presence guaranteed I'd love this movie whether it was actually good or not, and Stephen Dorff in one of his earlier roles, who I cannot disassociate as Deacon Frost, so it's always rough for me to see him in movies where he's not the bad guy. But in any event, the three of them are kind of hard-working, blue-collar space truckers. Well, Debbie Mazar is working in a cafe at a space truck bar, or a space truck restaurant, diner, whatever, and gets roped into this adventure where they end up transporting military death bots that will be used to conquer the planet Earth. And along the way, of course, hijinks ensue. There's basically a love triangle, sort of, for a little while. And you end up with Charles Dance in a major role. This is way before, of course, the stuff that people know him from now, like the Game of Thrones type of stuff, but still delivering what Charles Dance does. And there are going to be sequences in the film that you can tell are going on longer than they should be because they didn't have the budget to film maybe one or two more faster paced things to kind of smooth out the runtime, but they still have to make the 90-minute mark. And then you'll get to the kind of middle to the end of the film, which you can very clearly tell is set in probably a small warehouse of some kind or a light plane hangar, and yet is filmed so well in terms of using shadow, fog, deploying practical effects, having a lot of people on set in great costumes, that it does not hurt anything. And instead you get this really, really amazing sequence where they're fighting all these death bots, and it all works beautifully. And again, that's probably the best thing I can say about a movie like Space Truckers, because of course, there are movies I review that are definitely only for people like me. They are trash cinema classics, but they will not appeal to anybody who's not already into that. And then there's the obvious stuff, the top end, the Ridley Scott type films, where you just, obviously the quality's all there. But in the middle, you can get movies like Space Truckers that are just genuinely entertaining beginning to end. You start and end it with a smile, and sometimes, man, out of a movie, that's all you need. Later.